but it's a pleasure to be with you. And as Natalia says, I've had an interest since I started my teaching career in the kind of areas that you're all particularly concerned about, learning for sustainability and children's rights as well. So what I want to do is share with you some slides that give you a bit of a background to my report. I've tailored it very much to you as the DEC audience, and when I spoke to Natalia originally about making this presentation, she was keen that I did so, and that maybe gave you some indications as to where your work sits within the context of my report, which of course is more than just a report looking at replacing Education Scotland and SQA. It's turned out to be a report that is putting in place, I optimistically hope, the kind of future vision for the education system in Scotland, and the kind of work that the DECs do, I do feel will be critically important in this. So what I want to do is share my screen with you first of all, and hopefully this will come up. Can you just confirm that you can see that?
Yes.
Okay. Oops. Are you seeing the slides on its own, or are you seeing my mugshot in the middle of it?
Just the slides.
Okay, that's good then. Okay. Yeah, this was what Natalia sent me, drawing out specifically the role of global citizenship in the context of not just recommendations 1 and 2, which of course are about the national discussion, but more generally within the report. So as I say, what I want to do is maybe just set a wee bit of context to start with. You probably are aware that the remit I was given, the commission I was given, was to undertake these 4 things, all of which I have done. The government hasn't necessarily agreed with everything in detail in my report. The SQA being the most obvious example. I wanted SQA split into 2. The government, for various reasons, has decided that will not happen. But the rest of it, they have either agreed specifically with the recommendation or have agreed in principle around the recommendation about taking it forward. So, and as I say, it ended up being more than just a report about those 4 things. I was very keen at the outset to have as widespread an engagement with folk as possible around the commission I had been given. And as you're probably aware, part of what I did was engage with over 5,000 children and young people from the age of 5 right up to 18 and beyond, quite a few college groups as well. So not only is there my report, which actually I have on my desk here somewhere, I'm sure you've seen it, extra brownie points if you've read it, but what I also produced were reports showing the consultation returns that I got from children and young people, the consultation returns from the survey that I undertook. And I reckon that out of the 80,000 folk that are on GTC's register, that consultation return represented somewhere in the region of about 60,000 responses from teachers through the 851 consultation responses, and masses of stakeholder engagement. And then because I was so keen to reflect the views of children and young people, I produced an additional report, which some folk unkindly refer to as the Janet and John version, which is on the right-hand side there. And they're all available on the Education Reform Scottish Government website. And I'll maybe just say, Natalia, I'll share these slides with you at the end so that you can share them out with your DEC colleagues.
Thank you, that's great.
I thought it would be quite useful maybe just to start off by reminding you what you yourself said in the survey to my consultation return. The 3 themes that you picked out about the importance of, in any new curriculum, about the importance of skills, which is something that CFE, as you probably know, set out to do, but it was never really fully realised. And one of the reasons for that was because we remained, and to this day remain, a very examination-driven system. And the opportunities for young people to demonstrate those skills, whether it's critical thinking, political literacy, problem solving, all the sorts of things that you talk about there in your response to my consultation, they're open to teachers within the curriculum. But of course, if they're not valued and recognised in some forum, and I don't mean just through examinations, but generally because we are such an exam-driven system, I feel that teachers are very reluctant sometimes to place emphasis on these kinds of skills and skills development and revisiting these skills on a regular basis. Sustainability, absolutely critical. I'll say more about that in the course of the presentation. And also tie in global citizenship with some of the research that I undertook as part of my reading before I took up the commission over a year ago. The sorts of things that you talked about struck a chord with me. The lack of flexibility in CFE. I sometimes wonder if it's a lack of flexibility or whether it's just a lack of skill on behalf of practitioners and a lack of time, which is one of the points that Rachel picked up in the question that she sent in, and I'll touch on that. I might actually answer some of it, Rachel, in the course of the presentation, but particularly the ability to allow children to make links across the various disciplines and where was and where is interdisciplinary learning. It was certainly part of Curriculum for Excellence, but it kind of fell into a bit of a black hole. And as Natalia and David Innes know, I worked in Finland for a few years, and it was interesting when Finland was developing its future schools curriculum in 2016, 2017. One of the countries I visited was Scotland. And the folk I worked with at the National Board of Education in Helsinki made the point that they learned more about the curriculum and what influenced the Finnish curriculum, their new curriculum, from Curriculum for Excellence. And yet, IDL, which was an important element within Curriculum for Excellence, was never really, as I say, progressed to any great extent in Scotland. Whereas in Finland, there is a compulsory module every year for all children in a disciplinary methodology, and there's research going on just now in Finland looking at the effectiveness of that. Unfortunately, most of it's in Finnish, but what I've read of it, it's kind of mixed views. Some of it's done very well, and some of it much less so. But you can see some of the other things that you talked about in your consultation return, more consistent teacher empowerment, how we explore inequalities and are much more contextually aware, which I thought was a really important point. Looking at a curriculum model and assessment system that values the talents, skills and abilities of young people. And again, as I say, it's not something we've been particularly good at. It's one of the reasons why I was keen in my report to recommend that the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework was part of the new National Agency for Education that I'm recommending, which will be taken forward. SCQF, however, will not be part of that, but the Cabinet Secretary has stated very clearly that use of the Scottish Credit and Qualifications Framework as a way of valuing and recognising learning from early years right the way through, not just when children choose their subjects in secondary. That will be part of the future landscape. Things like valuing diversity, valuing, as I say, their wider achievement beyond academic achievement, greater options for learners in the senior phase, and better professional learning to support diversity, inclusion, and anti-racist education. I hope you'll see some, if not many, of those coming through the report. And in terms of what I'm going to say about where I see that future vision going, many of these general points being covered, if not immediately, then certainly over the next 5-year period, which is the kind of period of time that I'm thinking will be required for the reforms that I'm recommending. Specifically, when you talk about the new agency, you want and I like this expression, bold, brave and inclusive. not watered down in any way, and that's very much how I see it, with an initial purpose there, which I think will be taken forward. It may be an organisation, a national agency that is similar in size to Education Scotland initially. But as you'll see from what I'm going to say, I think that will rationalise significantly over the next 5-year period. And a national agency that works very closely with not just the DECs, but with all the various other parts of the system that are out there. If you've read my report, you'll see I don't talk very much about regional improvement collaboratives as bodies, but I do talk about regional collaboration. And I think that is part of the mindset that we need to embrace in the future, about how we use the resources that are out there without creating new bodies, how we use the resources, whether it be DECs, whether it be subject networks, whether it be research from universities and so on, much more effectively in a collaborative way than we currently do. When it came to SQA, you had lots to say. Too much assessment, again, recognising wider achievement and attainment as a subset of that. Looking at locally devised, as you said, they're cross-cutting interdisciplinary approaches that could form the backbone of Scottish education. And whilst my report is not specific about how we take that forward, there is work already underway by the Curriculum and Assessment Board, which is one of the bodies that Scottish Government have set up over a number of years to look at the curriculum and to take forward curriculum reform. And I'll say something more about CAB, the Curriculum and Assessment Body at the board, at the end of this presentation. Again, coming back to courses that, particularly in the senior phase, but across the board, that develop skills, values and attitudes, active citizenship, IDL kind of methodology, and even a suggestion about a baccalaureate type qualification. And I'm working with Louise Hayward on the work that she's doing. And that certainly is one of the options that we've been considering in order to allow greater learner-led inquiry and demonstrations of how young people approach that within their qualifications. Technology, yes. Opportunity and inequality, very much. We saw that through COVID. And then roles and responsibilities. You're absolutely right. That middle landscape between policy and practice is hugely cluttered. And I have some proposals that I've developed since the publication of the report that I've shared with those that I've spoken with, and also with Scottish Government. The advice and support from SQA and Education Scotland, I recognise the comments that you make in the consultation return about it not being coherent or well timed. So we need a mechanism with looking at the future vision for education that is much more responsive to the needs of practitioners on the ground. And having a large national body like Education Scotland, with its own agenda to some extent, trying to be responsive, but not necessarily always proving to be the case. We need a different kind of model of support, which is much more based around local and regional collaboration, but not necessarily regional improvement collaboratives, as you'll see from the report. And how we replace, well, you referred to them as centralist monoliths, very much akin to what my own thinking was at the time of the writing report, and even more so, the kind of empowerment that allows professionals to be supported at a much more local level than is the case at the moment. And you yourselves, along with others, made the point that we should be looking at redistributing some of the resource that sits in that middle ground between policy and practice. And I've got a couple of diagrams later on that will stress that. I'm simply sending you this because these just to remind you of what you said. As I say, I did a lot of research between agreeing a year past in April to do this and starting in the August. And one of the documents that was of particular interest to me was one written by Michael Fullan and Joanne Quinn. And interestingly, Joanne Quinn and I had a meeting when we were in Valparaiso there during last week. They were co-authors of this Education Redesigned report. And I was very taken with the wording in it because it suggests that education systems around the world have stalled. And I felt that was where we were in Scotland. I know Rachel's question asked about where we're going to find the time to take forward any kind of transformational reform. But I think that comes about as a result of agreeing a more systemic change to the education system than any one thing that can necessarily happen. And I'll pick up on that later. And again, Fuller and Quinn talk about education reform being high on the agenda, but it focusing mainly on literacy, numeracy, and what they call high school graduation, which really is about qualifications and examinations, rather than the holistic needs of students. And then this unpredictable global society that we currently are in and are likely to be in even more so in years to come. I spoke a lot to children and young people, as you'll be aware. These are some of the comments that they offered me, very perceptive, full of ideas, but one of the bugbears of many of them, whether it was in primary school or students in college sector and everything in between, feeling that their voices were not being listened to, and that where they were being listened to, it was very much at a superficial level. And it was one of the reasons why I entitled my report Putting Learners at the Centre, because I do think that learner voice is critical and will be even more critical in years to come. So you can see there some of the things, and interestingly, you know, that particular comment at the top about, you know, not learning enough about the real world and its problems is very much within the domain of the kind of work that DECs support across Scotland. This was the most troubling slide for me in all of the survey that I did with 5,000 odd young people. And it was a simple question on a 5-point scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. To what extent do you think you're having the best possible education experience? And this was the response from, you can see the numbers there, almost 4,000 children between the age of 12 and 18. And it basically breaks down into three 1/3 sectors. 1/3 who strongly agreed or agreed, but worryingly over a third, 38% who disagreed with that statement. And then the 32% in the middle, when you scratch below the surface, most of them were saying, well, some of it is a good educational experience, but some of it isn't. And that really worried me. And it was one of the reasons, it was one of the catalysts for me going much further in my report. And then if you look at the report, the children and young people's report, specific questions about the vision for curriculum for excellence and the extent to which that reflects what matters to children and young people. And I think we sometimes forget, and you'll all be aware of this yourselves, but I think we sometimes forget that children and young people have views and sometimes have very strong views about the kind of world that they feel they're living in and the kind of world that they want to live in the future and that they want their children to live in. And I've just picked out a couple of quotes there from that report. As I say, that report's available on the Education Reform website. You know, that we don't do enough about the environment and that climate change came through hugely in the responses that I got from young people. And many of them, I have to say, much more aware and concerned than sometimes I think adults are within British society, and not just British society, but more generally. The report itself focuses also on children's rights, and you'll see there that through the good offices of the three organisations, including Children's Parliament, of which I'm a trustee, who undertook the survey on my behalf. Number of questions there that you can look at in more detail that are covered in the response. You know, so to what extent is education helping them to develop their personality, talents and abilities to fullest potential, and so on. So there's a very detailed set of responses on all of those bullet points within that report. I'm not going to go through them all this morning. But one that I did pick out that I thought was most interesting from the report was, again, the question that was asked about to what extent does do they feel that their education experience helps them develop their personality, talents, and abilities to the fullest potential? Teasing out Article 29 in UNCRC. And again, you can see that whilst just over half agree, there's a fairly large minority who either disagree or strongly disagree, or who again are neutral about it. And from my point of view, points to the need for more of the kind of work that DECs are doing and other organisations in order to maximise the benefits of education for individual children. And I thought there was a very particularly pertinent couple of quotes within that report. One student who had responded to the survey that the three organisations carried out in my behalf, I didn't learn about human rights at schools, but they've done something at college. And then this really interesting one, it was someone who was running to be a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament, who had been in a number of schools themselves, and I'm sure some of you will have come across this, but just how shocking it was that students had no idea that they had rights or what UNCRC was about. So, more power to your own elbows in exposing these sorts of things, not just in terms of to students and young people, but to the teaching profession and more widely as well. And one of the reasons why Appendix F in my report has a couple of pages on UNCRC and particularly focusing on Article 29 was simply because of the concerns that came through the responses from children and young people themselves about the kind of education system that they want and the kind of world that they want to live in and that they want their children to live in. I'll very briefly just show a couple of slides again, just to set the context. Head teachers and teachers looking for more empowerment, the investment of time and resource in schools and what happens at the sharp end, as I call it. Concerns about the degree of politicisation within the education system in Scotland. My report goes some way towards trying to address that. And I have to say, having kept in touch with the senior civil servants, but also with the Cabinet Secretary and others within the senior kind of echelons of Scottish Government, I think they'll be delighted if over the next 5-year period, the reform of Scottish education can depoliticise the education system. Because I think part of the problem has been that the government, certainly rightly, will have the strategic responsibility for education, but I think they also have a sense that they want the operational responsibility, or they have the operational responsibility. And part of what I'm trying to suggest by way of a future vision, more of which I'll share with you in the next half hour or so, is to try and depoliticise the education system. A lot of criticism about the exams and SQA, and this very telling quote from a head teacher who said to me, I'm paid to be a leader of learning, but nothing more than a leader of administration. And we can't afford that in all sorts of senses, financially, as well as the risk to children and young people's education if we find that senior leaders in our establishments are simply pushing paper as opposed to pushing learning. And you'll see there the SCQF being mentioned. Very importantly, it talks, some of the head teachers and teachers I spoke about talked about the need for cultural and mindset shift. And part of what I think we do need to do within Scotland is within the education system, but more generally, more widely, we need to take quite seriously what Donella Meadows, the American researcher, talks about, the leverage points of change in a system. She's a systems expert. Sadly, she died a few years ago, but I've got a slide at the end that I'll talk a wee bit more detail about cultural and mindset shifting. And this deep debate and discussion, which of course has been taken forward by Carol Campbell and Alma Harris, and I'm hoping either later this week or next week to see some of the output from their national discussion. I gather that it's going particularly well. This is a slide that I use quite often. If you haven't seen it, you might find it useful yourself. This is from the Royal Society of Arts, of which I'm a fellow. And it was Anthony Painter, one of their staff, had a series of essays, Voice from a Future Generation. And he places himself in the year 2080, which might seem a long way off, but the passage of time just now seems to quicken by every day. So it's not that far off. And he looks back over his 30 years of life, and he sets it out in this very stark and very worrying essay. You might be able to access it through the Royal Society of Arts website. You might be able to just access it by Googling Anthony Painter himself. And this had a really profound impact in me as I was researching for my own report. And one of the things that I'll say at the end, or give you some ideas as to how you can move forward with the work of DECs in the context that I think we're going to find ourselves in. But this, for me, I've used at a number of conferences with children and with practitioners and educationists. And in fact, I shared it in one of the presentations that I did in Chile last week. And a number of folk came up to me at the end and said, "This is deeply troubling." And of course, we all hope that the worst excesses that Anthony Painter sets out here will not come to pass, but you'll know better than many that some of it is already happening. And I think it's when you begin to read this and internalize it and think about what's important, not just in life, but from our professional point of view, from what we want of an education system for current generation and future generations over the next 20, 30 years, 50 years even, it begins to put a different perspective on what's important. And I genuinely believe that although, as Rachel says in her question to me, teachers are under a hell of a lot of pressure just now. Yes, they are. But what I found in my consultation returns and talking to teachers in particular, there is a genuine sense that if we don't do something now in the next couple of years and take the opportunity, given what we've gone through over the last 2 or 3 years, plus my report and the national discussion and some of the other surveys that are taking place just now, if we don't grasp the opportunity to make fundamental change to Scottish education, then we'll be doing a huge disservice to students over the next generation and couple of generations. So yes, it will be difficult, and of course change is always difficult. Cultural and mindset change even more so. But this, for me, Anthony Painter's essay, it was the third of 3 essays that he produced for the Royal Society of Arts, really blew my mind, as did one of the books that I'll talk about, Tom Fletcher's book, which if you haven't read, it really is essential reading, not just for folk like yourselves, but it's essential reading, I think, for students. It should be in every reading list across the world, but I'll pick more of that later. Other factors that impact on the future vision, you'll be aware that technological change is with us, hugely so. We saw that particularly through COVID, but children have begun to use, and have been for a number of years, using things like Khan Academy and Khan for Kids. And their kind of logo is you can learn anything for free, for everyone, forever. And some of the young people I spoke to were using lessons and blogs and so on that sit within Khan for Kids and Khan Academy to supplement the learning that they did during the COVID lockdown. We know that students change. You'll know that yourself as practitioners in the past or current practitioners. We currently have Generation Alpha that are a radical difference to the kind of young people we've had in our schools over the last 10, 20 years. IT and technology flowing through their veins, much more skilled in using technology than many of the teachers that we have in schools. And that's unlikely to change in the years to come. So a major factor in what we might envisage for a future education system in Scotland has to take account of that technological change, and also the fact that every 15, 20 years or so, the nature of children coming through into our schools changes. So we're past the millennial generation, Generation Y and Generation Z. We've got 10 years worth of the new Generation Alpha in our system, in our schools, beginning to populate our secondary schools, who learn very differently to future generations, who have an expectation, not just about how we use technology, but have an expectation about the society they want to live in that is much more realistic, I think, than previous generations. Climate change, of course, will always be a driver. Biodiversity and the need to ensure biodiversity. Societal change. I've picked out a couple of pictures here that I really love that show societal change in action. The left-hand photo, I know it doesn't show very well, but it's St. Peter's Square, and the previous Pope at his inauguration, and you can see lots of folk there looking and clapping in the direction of the pontiff. And then the most recent Pope, when he stood on the balcony in the Vatican City on his appointment, and all you can see is a sea of iPhones and iPads. And if that doesn't demonstrate cultural change over what is an 8-year period, and you'll know yourselves from your own experiences, that change has quickened in pace even more so over the years. And for me, one of the biggest drivers is going to be economic change. We are in at least 5 years of severe austerity, maybe even more. And the one certainty in an unknown future is that there will be less money kicking about. And it's the very comment that both Rachel and David offered in their question, how do we influence the purse holders to ensure that finance gets to the sharp end of things in the education system in order that we can prepare children and young people for the future that we all anticipate, but we're not absolutely certain sure what it will look like. We've done work in Scotland. The Goodison Group and Scotland's Futures Forum have done work over the last 5 years. I was involved in a lot of that. And what came through these are the main findings of a 5-year report. Again, if you Google it, when you get the slides, you'll see what it says. But there are a number of words and phrases that come through regularly about the kind of education system or the features of an education system that we require for the future: flexibility, co-creation. You can see them all there. All of which, as you'll be aware, have a very close tie-in with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it was interesting being part of this exercise, seeing how the two came together. UNCRC and the work of Goodison Group, one of the think tanks in Scotland, and Scotland's Futures Forum. And within my own, within the report, the Goodison Group report, I was particularly taken with this conclusion about us having some way to go in Scottish society and global society towards having a truly humanised education system. That report had a real impact on what I wrote in my own report, but also in what I've been finalising and saying in these presentations. And again, I certainly commend it to you. It's a more than worthwhile report to have a look at. And having been part of the discussions around its creation, although I didn't write anything for it, I felt that this particular sentence had really chimed with what I felt the direction of travel for Scottish education needed to be. And of course, within Scotland, you know that the government has a body of the International Council of Education Advisors. You can see some of the great and good in world education. Carol Campbell, who of course we signed up to facilitate the discussion, who's currently in Canada. Chris Chapman from Glasgow, Graham Donaldson, well known to many of you. Andy Hargreaves, Alma, Paris again, working with Carol, Pasi Salberg from Finland, and so on. And you can see the sorts of things that they were saying way back in 2018 about the direction of travel that's required for an education system in the third decade of the 21st century. Looking specifically at Scotland, a shift to professionally led education improvement, an empowered education professional system, meeting local needs and priorities and changes and challenges, and looking at co-ownership of the education system in order to deliver excellence, because none of this can be about dropping the kind of standards that we expect, but equity being really prominent within that. And one of the early messages from the Education Council of the International Council of Advisors was that we should be talking about a curriculum for excellence and equity. And I happen to think that we probably got the wording of our new curriculum almost 20 years ago wrong when we talked about excellence, because I think it put a particular skew or slant on how folk interpreted that. And had we started off with curriculum for excellence and equity, or even for equity and excellence, then I think we would have been in a different place today. Again, just for your own information, a couple of things that I looked at by way of my own research: World Economic Forum, Future of Jobs survey. Interesting that they surveyed businesses, commerce, industry, and so on within the UK. And these were the high demand skills and competencies and dispositions that they felt were required for the next 20 years. And you'll see there a lot of the sorts of things that you talked about in your response to my report about analytical thinking, opportunity to be creative and innovative, complex problem solving, critical thinking. But it was interesting from my point of view that this was industrialists, this was businesses, this was commerce out there in the UK world, basically saying, we recognise that these are the sorts of things that we require in the future. And the question that it posed to me was, again, as I said earlier, how much stress and emphasis within the curriculum do we put on developing these sorts of things with children and young people in the formal education sector? And again, you'll be well aware of this report, given your background, the 2019 UNESCO report. Again, you can see the sorts of things that they're talking about by way of future competencies that should be built into the curriculum. And going back to Michael Fullan, the 6 C's, as he calls them, the 6 global competencies, you'll be aware of them, as I say. There is a breakdown within the slides if you can't access Michael's report, but citizenship coming through really importantly within this, the importance of having a global perspective, understanding of and interest in human and environmental sustainability and so on. So I've set out those 6 C's there for you, just as I say, in case you can't access them. This is a really important mindset, I think. Ian Golden, the education professor at Oxford, spoke to an IDL conference in the Royal Society of Edinburgh a few years ago. And he made this point about globalization, because it is the kind of world that we live in. It continues to leave people behind. And it is important in thinking about a future vision for Scottish education that we leave no one behind. I know I sound a bit like Obama there when I say that, no child left behind, but the sentiment behind that is really important. And it's one of the reasons why throughout the report, I talk about putting learners at the centre. And in retrospect, the report should have been called Putting All Learners at the Centre, because I think it's too easy for some of them to slide off the radar, particularly those who come from the more disadvantaged backgrounds. You'll know in the report, recommendation 1, building a compelling consensual vision, that's been taken forward through the work of Alma and Carol, and the importance of the purposes within Article 29 of the Convention. And this was a really important thing, and I think Carol and Alma have done well to take forward this recommendation. Very often in Scotland, and it's the same in all education systems, I mean, I've seen it happen in Finland, for example, when I worked there. It's those who shout the loudest tend to get listened to, or the biggest organisations. And I was very keen that the consultation ensures this, what's called narrative privilege, not just to the educational bodies, but to everybody. And your debt return, I think, demonstrates to a degree, in one sense, just how widespread the consultation response was, because there were many others, organisations who took up the opportunity to respond. And you'll see in the report, in the response to what matters in curriculum now, a very clear steer within my report to developing the need to develop the skills, attitudes, knowledge, and such like, and values in the context of learning for sustainability. So Carol and Alma have undertaken this consultation. You'll know if you've participated in it, I'm sure you have. The wee blurb at the beginning, I spoke a lot to Alma and Carol before they set up the consultation facilitation. And this text at the top is something that they use as an intro to the big question, what kind of education system do we need children and young people to have in the future, and how do we make that a reality? An education system that is collectively developed, creative, clear, tackles the challenges that face not just the current generation of children and young people, but future generations as well. And again, the questions that they ask, I know some of them get a bit of a slagging when they came out at first as being too general, but actually, according to Carol and Alma, keeping them at quite a high level has elicited some really interesting responses to what they've been, what folk feel about what's required for the future curriculum and education system more widely. So within my report, I set out a number of principles or factors that need to be considered. Article 29 and UNCRC more generally is going to be a key driver and needs to be a key driver within the education system, as does excellence and equity. We need a system where we have much more place-based, responsive, bespoke support to folk at the sharp end, because that isn't happening across the board at the moment. And there's huge inequity in how that is approached at the moment. We need to look much more and give much more credibility to what happens in early years and early learning. And part of my thinking in the future vision is about an education system that values and recognises the importance of early years, much more so than is the case just now. I mean, I had responsibility when I was Director of Inspection for early years inspections, and absolutely converted to the value of that. And I heard someone talk at a conference once saying that the 6 most important years in a child's life is up to the age of 5. And I firmly believe that. So we need an education system that recognises and values learning from the very start of life, and doesn't just suddenly feel that learning is important when Wayne's choose our subjects halfway through secondary school. And of course, outdoor learning, there's a very strong push for outdoor learning. And I was saying to Natalia when we spoke with David to the Shetland teachers a couple of months ago now, one of my Finnish colleagues read my report after it was published just almost a year ago now, and said that the report was trying to make Scotland the 6th Nordic country. Now, that wasn't my intention, but of course, you'll know there that outdoor learning plays a very prominent part in the education system. So 1 or 2 other things there that I felt needed to be taken into account, and factors that needed to be addressed in impacting a future education system. Climate change itself, biodiversity, very, very important drivers. Simplification and coherence in policy and support. At the moment, we have 10 directorates in the Scottish Government that impact directly day to day on policies in schools. Far too many. Part of the mindset and cultural shift has to be that Scottish Government look at how it formulates policy, much less from the top down and much more from the bottom up, using the expertise in organisations like yourselves, but using the expertise of teachers and practitioners on the ground. Remembering that for all these policies and their best intentions, the one thing that all international research shows makes the biggest difference is the quality of learning and teaching. So the big message within my report, one of the big messages is about redistributing the resource. And I'll say more about that briefly before I conclude. Looking at the metrics that we use within education, culturally and in terms of mindset shift, really important. It's not just about the number of hires that a youngster gets in a single sitting in S5. We need to have a culture and mindset across the piece, whether it be journalists or parents or teachers themselves, that value the wider range of achievements. Some of the very things you said in your DEC response. We need this redistribution of power and influence and resource to a much more bottom-up hierarchy than is the case at the moment. And we need to build more trust in the system. I was interested in the GTC Scotland's recent survey on trust. And it was interesting that whilst parents and stakeholders out there in the general public, the majority said that they trusted the teaching profession, most teachers felt that they didn't, and that they weren't held in trust. So there's something to be done around building trust, ensuring that resources meet needs. And again, I'll say more about that in a minute, because it is a very pertinent point. And as David Innes said in his question, how do we actually finance all of this? And very importantly, we need a system where there is appropriate governance. I called it good governance, but governance that involves experts and practitioners on the ground in all of these bodies that exist out there in the educational firmament, much more so than is the case at the moment. This diagram, and I'm not going to go through all the right-hand bit in detail, but this diagram divvies up the system, as I think we all know it, into three. The policy bit at the top, the government bit at the top, those who are delivering at the sharp end at the bottom, and then this huge infrastructure of entities in the middle ground. And you can see in the right-hand side, if you just scan through some of the things I've already talked about the fact that we've 10 directorates in Scottish Government impact in education, that policy is fragmented, it's very top-down, and so on. And you can see from the diagram there, many of the arrows going down and impacting directly, and very often in an unreasonable and unmanageable way on practitioners on the ground, on head teachers, schools, sometimes even on local authorities themselves, but sometimes local authority policy simply adds to the overlay of policy that folk are expected to live with. And at the bottom end there, as I say, I know it's a pejorative way of describing it, but at the sharp end, limited agency and empowerment, limited learner voice, lack of consultation with experts, and so on. So part of what I set out to do in my report was to try and change that to a system that, as you'll see there, still has a degree of top-downness to it, as it will always need to have, but much more use of the system and the expertise at the ground level. So rationalising the government directorates, less policy and more policy coherence, bottom-up expertise being much more used, ministers retaining strategic policy responsibility, as you would expect, but the policy for, or the responsibility for enacting those policies lying much more at the sharp end and where appropriate with local authorities. A new national agency in that middle ground that brings together and will eventually subsume some of the bodies that currently exist and inhabit that middle ground, so that there is much greater coherence, that facilitates support but doesn't necessarily provide it itself. And some of the savings that are created by adopting this model, creating both the time and the resource and the space at the sharp end to allow transformational change to take place. A new examination and awarding body whose focus is not on curriculum, because at the moment, SQA, having the responsibility for conditions and arrangements, is seen to be the driver for curriculum change in Scotland. Is seen to be the holder and have responsibility for the curriculum. And it's not just in secondary. One of the messages that came through very strongly to me when speaking to primary head teachers was that many of them feel that the upper primary curriculum is being adversely impacted by what's required of secondary schools. And of course, when you talk about secondary education, the main metric around the success or otherwise tends to be examination performance. And we need to change that culture and mindset shift. And in the model I'm proposing, the sharp end having much more responsibility and much more direct impact on how policy is formulated and the kinds of things that are happening on the ground, changing that policy on an ongoing basis, as opposed to us being kind of hammered about from pillar to post with reactive shifts in policy, using the expertise on the ground, using the expertise in organisations like yourselves and other bodies that provide support, and using the national agency as the filter through which think tanks, national bodies like yourselves and others, university research come together to help to formulate and inform government policy. So it's a very different model from where we are just now to where I think we need to be. I've tried to demonstrate this by a couple of diagrams. What is driving, what's the big cog that's driving education at the moment? My sense is that it's qualifications and assessment, driving the curriculum, learning and teaching. That isn't healthy. That's not what we need for children and young people over the next 20, 30 years. We need a model where the curriculum and assessment as part of learning and teaching drives not just the qualifications, but drives what we value. And having that value and recognition of wider achievement. Interestingly, I got an email this morning from Victoria Vardy, who is the chief executive of an organisation called iGen. And the Vardy Foundation, you'll maybe be aware of Vardy, the car sales folk. Sir Peter Vardy and I had a meeting about 3 months ago now, and he is investing hugely through his foundation on a programme not just of professional learning, but an online digital programme of lessons and modules that young people can undertake through this iGen project. And not only are the lessons brilliant, and I've seen a lot of them, the professional learning that they're putting together is really very impressive. And it's focused on recognising the kinds of skills and competencies and the kind of leadership that we want to inculcate within children and young people currently and in the future. And it's the kind of things that, you know, you talked about in your consultation return to me, the kinds of skills of analysis and critical thinking, developing collaborative approaches, developing cooperation, understanding quality and diversity, and the wider context, the wider global context within which we currently exist and which we will exist even more so in the future. So if you haven't looked up iGen, it's just a small I hyphen capital GEN. There is a website that they have. All of the schools in Dumfries and Galloway, primary and secondary, 96 primary schools and I think 17 secondary schools are taking part in this programme. What I like about it is that there is an electronic journal kept, and the young people get badges as they work their way through these lessons and modules. But the thing about it is, for me, one of the ways that we better recognise and value wider achievement is genuinely by having some kind of digital portfolio that can be kept, not a record of achievement in old thinking, you know, where years ago we stuffed lots of paper into a red folder and that was a record of achievement. We've moved on from there. There is nothing to stop us developing a digital e-portfolio or profile that children and young people can keep and be supported by teachers and give young people the voice to be able to say what they have achieved as opposed to the narrow metrics of examination and assessment results. So moving to a system, from a system which has been very much that way around to one that is much more that way around. And another way of looking at it is on the left-hand side, you know, in simple terms, what I would characterise as the education system in Scotland just now, before reform, and how I think it should be after reform. So much less steer from the top, much more agency from the bottom, impacting on policy, impacting on the outcomes for learners, and more bespoke support and less challenge. There will always be accountability, of course, but one of the criticisms that came through, particularly from teachers, was that they felt that the accountability regime that we have in the education system in Scotland is far too onerous, and that there should be more trust in the professionalism of teachers and practitioners. I talked about Donella Meadows, and I'm just about finished here, but I talked about Donella Meadows. She's written a number of books on systems thinking, and this looks like quite a complicated diagram, but it's actually very simple. What she says is that most of the attempts to change education systems, or systems generally, only get as far as the first leverage point. All we ever do is we shift the infrastructure, we change the metrics, we change some of the resources, and so on. If we want genuine system change, we need to tackle the leverage points at the top end of this seesaw. We need to look at how we shift the goals, the beliefs, the values that orientate an education system, or indeed any system. And I was particularly taken with this diagram in our book, Thinking in Systems, because that's where we need to be. If we are going to do justice to children and young people in the current generation going through the schools and in future generations, we need to adopt a systems change to what we provide. Because at the moment, and many folk have said this to me, for all it does well for some children and young people, and there are undoubted strengths in the education system. In my old school, Dunoon Grammar School, won the Best School in the World award just about a month ago for community collaboration. But there aren't a lot of schools like that. And whilst there is some very good practice, there are children who end up sliding off the scale or sliding into oblivion. And we can't afford that to happen in any future vision for Scottish education. So what we have are a number of reviews: my report, the national discussion, the recent review of tertiary education, Louise Hayward's review of qualifications and assessment. The government's announced the review of the skills delivery landscape. There are other things happening, arguably too many, and whilst I'm not responsible for all of them, although I think sometimes some folks seem to think so, my hope is that at some point over the next year or so, there will be an articulation and a coherence that will bring together all of this. And I'm an eternal optimist, and I'm pretty sure that that will happen. There will be some pain and some grief, I don't doubt it. But I think we're beginning to put into place some of the initial steps that will allow significant reform to take place. I talked about Tom Fletcher's book, and I want to finish just with 2 or 3 slides to get you thinking yourselves around the role of DEC, because that was basically what Natalia asked me to do. I've picked out a couple of quotes from Tom's book here. We need a more profound knowledge of our relationship with our planet, don't we just? You know, you only need to watch David Attenborough's Extinction Programme, which I watched again actually in the flight back from Chile 2 nights ago. Or was it last night? No, it was 2 nights ago. You know, it is the one thing that every young person should be exposed to, is to be sat down and watch that programme, because it really does open doors and open minds. It talks about, Tom Fletcher talks about the need for learners to develop these kind of skills, competencies and dispositions, the very things that you talk about in the work that you do, and how we learn to learn, which is really interesting, because my initial work in Finland was on a project called Learning to Learn. I can talk more about that with you at some point in the future. But you know, we need to learn in order that future generations can be adaptable enough to evolve in response to. And I would say it's not just the technology tsunami, it's all of societal change. that is coming down the line at quite a pace. And the current education system will not set well those young people who are going through a system just now and for the future. So thinking about the role of yourselves in global citizenship, some of the things that you might want to be thinking about. The curriculum is currently changing. The Curriculum and Assessment Board, as I say, which is one of the bodies that's been set up by Scottish Government to respond to the OECD report that was the catalyst for me being involved. That's underway at the moment. Folk like Mark Priestley at Stirling is very heavily involved in that. Some of you may have inroads to the work that Mark does. I think you need to find ways of continuing to influence curriculum change and the stress and emphasis that needs to be given to developing global citizenship, developing an understanding of what Article 29 and the UNCRC more generally talks about. I think it is helpful, it will be helpful to be thinking in the work that you do about how the messages that you want to get over will influence future pedagogy, because sure as goodness, the current practice that we have in terms of pedagogy will not suit what is required for the future. And that goes back a lot to what I said about the change to Generation Alpha that we currently have in our primary and just about to kick into our secondary schools. These are a very different group of young people. And we need to be thinking, when I say we, I'm talking generally the system, but I'm thinking particularly from my UWS, with my UWS hat, how initial teacher education is going to need to change in order to take account of all the things I've talked about with you this morning. Taking every opportunity to look at, promoting change in what we value in education, and again, looking at wider achievements and recognizing those wider achievements, continuing to do the kind of work you're doing, which I saw firsthand with David and Natalia in Shetland, as I say, a couple of months ago, around the kind of areas that you're expert in. And you need to remember that you are experts in that, teachers aren't. It goes back to the point that was made by Rachel about how do we find the time and space. But as I say, I do think rationalising some of that middle ground in Scottish education, even though the budget difficulties that the government will face will kick in even more significantly, I think, in years to come, but a redistribution of that resource so that time and space can be created at the sharp end, as I showed in the diagrams, to allow the kinds of things to happen that need to happen. Promoting and supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly the Education Goal 4. I know that you're actively involved in that. It's about profiling a lot of these things. And interestingly, the one thing that I did open in my mail when I came back last night was the most recent edition of GTC's Teaching Scotland magazine, and a really good article within it on international recognition for learning for sustainability. I don't know if any of you were involved in writing it because it didn't say who wrote it, but again, publicising the importance of global citizenship and learning for sustainability, and doing all you can to support that cultural and mindset shift in society, and that includes the educational society as well. These are the sorts of things that I know that you're involved in some of that, but from my point of view, I think would be beneficial as we move forward. This is a slide that I think sums up the critical point that we are at the moment. Gilbert Chesterton, you'll be aware of him perhaps as an English author. And I love this quote: education is simply the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to the next. And that, to me, there are two really important, profound messages in that. One is that education is a key driver in influencing society, and we all know that. What we do in education, what we teach children and young people, goes with them throughout their life and has a direct impact on influencing the kind of society that they create in the future. But the second big message is that education is influenced by what happens in wider society as well. And we need an education system that is going to be responsive to those changes. And as I said earlier, if there's one thing that's a sure certainty for the future, is that the society that we have lived in is already changing, has already changed, and it will change even more so for the current generation and the next generations of children and young people. And we need an education system that is going to prepare them as best as possible. Final slide, this is just a set of questions that I've put together as part of a kind of professional learning offer. Folks saying, how do I get into all of this? And head teachers have said to me, so I recognize what you're saying, Ken, and I want to get into it. What do you suggest? Well, there's half a dozen or so questions that I think you wouldn't need to use them all, but pick and choose in order to try and get practitioners thinking about a future vision for the education system in Scotland, what a future curriculum might need to look like. And these are just some starter questions. So I'm conscious I maybe ran over a wee bit there, Natalia, but I hope that's been helpful to you and your colleagues.